Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Charles. We're all with Secure, and today we're going to be talking about stable vulnerability identifiers in our reports and potentially beyond. So this conversation came out of a recent issue that I would actually switch the order of these two related issues in this agenda and say adding a new ID property came first. But after some discussions with Daniel, we're trying to figure out if we're actually going to be solving the same problem with these two things. So I guess running down these questions first, let's start from the beginning, which is why are we changing the algorithm for generating the compare key? So who wants to take that one?
Should I?
Up to you.
Okay, try to make this quick. We have 25 minutes at most. So the CVA property has to be deprecated. It's a legacy field that contains various data depending on the analyzer, which is not consistent, not predictable, and causing a lot of issues because people think it's CV, whereas it's not. So as we want to facilitate things for third-party integrators and even for us to clean things up, we want to replace that with a properly named field that will allow us to solve one thing, which is making sure we can uniquely identify a unique occurrence, a unique finding reported by a scanner in a given report. This not needs to be stable across different executions. This is addressed by other ways. And this has to be unique so that two different findings could be separately identified when we are generating remediations. The initial purpose of that property is that we can have a remediations array that can allow you to map with a given finding so that the backend, when it will process the report, will be able to match them together. Now, the current CV property is used for different purposes. So on top of being ugly and with mixed values, it's also used for two different things, which is using matching the remediation with the finding, which is what we are trying to replace with this new ID property. And the second one, it's used to generate the project fingerprint value, which is leveraged by all the vulnerability feedbacks to do the matching with a finding and a feedback. So we have two separate issues. The first one is to add a new ID to replace the legacy CVA when it comes to identifying uniquely a finding for the primary purpose of using it in remediations. And then we have a second issue, which is migrating the feedback so that it doesn't leverage anymore the CVE. And with these two steps being achieved, we now can remove the CVE property, because we will no longer use it for any purposes. And talking about CVE, it's been a long time that the real CVE is part of the identifiers array. Does that answer your question?
I think maybe that's really good background. I think more so what I'm curious about in particular with this question is the previous algorithm hashed together a couple of fields. Was that not unique enough within the context of a report or a pipeline run?
The problem is we were needing some stability in this property so that from different pipeline executions, we are generating the same CV value, because this was leveraging the project fingerprint, which is used to map a finding with a feedback. And we want to keep the feedback stable. For example, you run the first report, you get vulnerabilities, you get findings with a given CV value. You create a feedback by creating an issue or merge request or dismissing that finding. Then you run another pipeline. You still have the same finding, but if the CV value is different, then the project fingerprint will be different, and the existing feedback won't be matched with this finding. So you will lose the feedback you created in the previous pipeline. So this is why we were trying to generate that value based on as precise properties as possible, like often it's taking a primary identifier, it's taking a hash of some stable properties like the line number, which is not as stable as we can think about it, but this is why it's super crappy. It's because it really depends on the analyzer and it's not well done for quite some time. And this is why when it comes to identifying a vulnerability on the Rails backend, we no longer use that property. We moved away from that and use instead the report type, the primary identifier, and the location fingerprint, which is generated from various location subproperties depending on the report type. And the goal is to do the same for the feedback.
So jumping ahead, can we generate the CV using the exact same properties? And then we'll be okay.
Using the ID, you mean?
If we didn't care about deprecation and if we just were like, we need to make the CVE better and change no code, could we just create a hash of the report type, primary identifier, and location, and then we're good?
This is what I initially was thinking about, and we had a brainstorming session about this quite some time ago. And the answer was, we don't need it. We could do that, but we don't need to do that. The problem comes with third-party integrators, because if we want to do that, we need to expose to third-party integrators how to generate that ID. And depending on the system and the way they are generating their vulnerabilities, they might want to use a unique way of generating the ID, and they might want to use an ID that they can track back later. To me, this is a different purpose, and this needs to be achieved with vendor fields, specific field that you can put in the specific part of the report. But the decision was taken that to move forward quickly, we need to just add a specific field to address our specific need, which is making sure we have a unique ID for a given occurrence, a given finding in the report, to leverage that with the remediation.
Okay, so to clarify, first off, thank you so much for digging into this. I know we're kind of bringing this back up, but this has been really useful for me to just understand the code base and how it all gets tied together with the Rails app and whatnot. So I see this field CVE, I'm going to talk about the old field, has had multiple jobs. And it seems that maybe are we trying to make ID only do like one of those previous jobs and then change the way in that way? Is that correct? Okay. And so this new ID field really only needs to be unique within the context of a single report. And it won't be used for grouping occurrences into a vulnerability in the future. Okay, that all makes sense. So just not as a suggestion, but just pushing on my understanding of the problem, technically, could we just enumerate 0 through 1 through however many and just put an integer as the ID? Oh, because you have to take an occurrence and it needs to be a function that takes the occurrence and generates the same. Is that why?
No, if I remember correctly, it's written in the issue. We had this conversation with Fabian. I think it's because this has to be unique within the context of not a scan, but a given scanner. And this is why we wanted to initially to couple that with the scanner ID. And the reason is because we will aggregate that with other scans for the same report type. We might end up with having vulnerabilities, different vulnerability finding, having the same ID, which is not something we want to deal with.
Sorry, so by scan, so assuming you have a pipeline that has 2 different jobs, it does a ESLint scan and it does secrets. That generates 2 JSON reports in separate jobs. Those are, just to clarify your language, that's 2 scans. Okay. And so we actually do need to correlate across scans then. I'm not sure I'm quite following. I guess I'm not quite following that, because a remediation is always scoped within a report, right? So if we use something like an array index of vulnerabilities, I still don't really see why that wouldn't work.
Because when we process remediation, it can be after we aggregated the data. I don't think the remediation algorithm is tied to a given scan. Maybe this is something we can revisit in the future, but for now, we generate multiple JSON reports on the analyzer side that might not know about the others. So we need to make sure they independently are capable of generating a unique ID because they don't know about the others. They don't know how we will aggregate things on the Rails backend, and we don't know how we will leverage this remediation ID later. Maybe we will move the remediation stuff in a separate job. So to avoid any future blockings in the way we will architect the remediation per workflow, having a uniquely generated ID is the best approach to me. And this is why I was initially pushing for using a UID. But we have another issue is that we already have a UID column in the vulnerability occurrences table, which is for a different purpose. So it's a bit complicated.
So again, to clarify here, previously we said we need it to be unique within the context of a report, but actually the context is within an analyzer. It needs to be unique to an analyzer within that context, right? Is that correct? Because you want to be able to say, here's an ID, and this points at a single occurrence within all the runs for this analyzer.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is why we were trying to make a compound ID using the scanner ID.
And because there was a word, sorry, just because there's a word before, scanner and analyzer are almost always the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
The property is scanner ID, but obviously a given analyzer is always running scan for the same scanner. And there are multiple things to consider when thinking about this kind of ideas, like the fact that today we have one analyzer only running one job for itself, but we could later run the same analyzer on two separate jobs for improving performance, concurrency, or because we want, for example, we are discussing scanning multiple Docker images with container scanning. So we can have two jobs of container scanning running at the same time on two different images. So this is the kind of thing we consider when thinking about the uniqueness of this ID. And this is why, to me, a UID is the best possible way, because we are making sure it's always unique.
So during this conversation, I keep thinking how confusing this will be for the future if we don't just use the exact same uniqueness identifiers that we use in Rails. Namely, going back to generating this identifier, you said like we probably don't need it, but generating this from the report type, primary identifier, and location at least means we're using the same identifier for vulnerabilities everywhere, or sorry, for findings everywhere. And it seems like that's going to reduce a lot of confusion down the road. So I just want to double check that that's not the direction we want to go, because it looks like it'd be a fairly simple code change from where Fabien's MR is right now.
The only drawback about this is we need to expose in the analyzers and to third-party integrators how to generate the location fingerprint, because the report type is obvious. The primary identifier is relatively obvious. It's the first identifier you put there, and we have explained in the documentation that this has to be something really unique and stable for that specific finding. And the last part is the most complicated one, which is which properties from the location object are we taking to generate this location fingerprint. So this is a compromise between taking as much precise properties as possible to make this the most uniquely possible way to identify this finding, and to distinguish in the most finest grained way two different vulnerabilities. The best example is you have two vulnerabilities on the same line of code. The only difference is which columns in that file is impacted. We are not able to distinguish those two cases today because we don't go down to the line number. And this is a specific example to SAS, but we have different problems depending on the other report type. Yeah, Thomas?
Why are we treating this as a public API contract?
Could you explain further?
You've brought in third-party integrations, which tells me that we're treating this JSON format as a public API contract.
Yeah.
Why are we bringing that into scope rather than treating this as an internal data structure that we can then map whatever we're going to propose third-party integrators use and decouple these constructs or decouple these two issues?
Well, I'm trying to explain what would be the impact to exposing to third party to use the specific properties. And this is the reason why we choose to not go that route, because we don't want to expose that logic. Because if today we say for container scanning, we don't use this way to generate the location fingerprint, but instead we pick those different properties, we will have to tell that to all the integrators and ask them to change the way they are generating the reports. Whereas if we just keep that internal, we just say, hey, here are the properties that you need absolutely to fill in the report. And then if we change the logic behind that, we can do that internally. And this is why, to me, the UID approach is better. And we don't need to expose that complex identification logic and use this as the identifier for remediation purpose in the report. I lost you.
But it would change. Like if the line number changes and we're just hashing the entire object, I think that's fine. It will change the identifier because the data has changed. So we just say the entire location matters. Keep it consistent and it will keep the identifier consistent.
Yep. I mean, for the purpose of remediation, yeah, that's fine. The problem is you might do some aggregation already at that report level. So if you have two vulnerabilities today on the same line, you will have two vulnerabilities in the report file having the same ID.
So it kind of seems like what would be clearest also for third-party integrators is to, I think it's still not completely clear to me the use case for the identifier, right? Because there are multiple problems that need to be solved with how we think through this. One is, grouping, and we've already stated that's not what this is going to be for. It was what CVE is, not for this. Just pushing on my understanding again. Just a second. Just pushing on my understanding. So if we actually just used an enumeration, so just 1, 2, 3, 4, and put a number, not UDID, not unique, across the board, not a hash, did that in a report, and then in remediation, we actually said pipeline ID or report ID plus the ID, which is just an index basically that's cached into the report or persisted, if you will. Would that be a solution? Just trying to make sure I understand the use case is that this points to a specific occurrence for all the runs within this analyzer.
It could even be a job ID, which would be more precise, I think. This will be the most precise way that we can identify it. The problem is it adds
very much so, and so it's very much so an occurrence ID. So like this, we found this one time, it points to this very moment in time. Yep, that makes sense, and it's not for. It's this kind of a vulnerability or this specific instance in the code. So really don't use this for grouping because it'll just create a vulnerability for each and every one. Yep, okay, that makes sense.
And the other reason we don't want to expose that is because this is not something common. A lot of tools in our competitors doesn't do that. This complex identification logic and all the algorithm behind that to recognize a vulnerability between execution is something really important for GitLab because we are adding a ton of feature on top of this reporting. It's not just a one-shot report, a one-shot status about what findings do we have found in your project. Is we are constantly watching the status of your project, capable of maintaining attached properties to this, attached metadata like feedback. And we are able to aggregate multiple different reports into the same view, etc. So all of these features are built on top of simple reporting. And third-party integrators doesn't have this logic, and we don't want to expose that to them and force them to follow it because we might change this in the future. And this is why not putting all of these primary identifier, location fingerprint logic into the report and into this identifier generation was decided in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was surfaced yesterday when I was talking to Lucas about the Rails app actually has all the information to be able to group appropriately. It can change its algorithm, etc. Us trying to impose that probably the wrong place to do that. So that makes sense. Just to make sure I understand too, with regards to the use case for auto remediation, do you, like in the case of UDID or UUID or like some randomly generated thing, and when is it Gymnasium that does this, that can auto remediate? How is it going to do the lookup into find what it actually solved? You know, do you not need the actual occurrence to be able to basically kind of like we're doing where we can hash it in this point in time, you know?
I see what you mean. I don't know much about the remediation algorithm, so I will let Fabian answer that. And I think this is part of the problem with this current approach.
Yeah, I wrote a comment this morning about the implementation. I don't know if you've read that one. Right now, Gymnasium, and it's pretty similar.
No, don't crash your connection. That's too easy. That's too easy, Fabian. I saw you unplug the Ethernet cable.
Are we talking about this?
Oh gosh,
Yeah, we are talking about this.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it covers pretty much everything. No, I'm kidding. Please go ahead, Fabian.
Yes, so Gymnasium generates a list of vulnerabilities using its vulnerability database and the dependency files parsers. So anyways, it finds vulnerabilities, but it finds them in its own, using its own data model, converts that to vulnerabilities, generic vulnerabilities, and I mean the JSON report, and it reuses, recycles in a way the scan results to perform remediation, finds these remediation objects, yeah, so to speak, and convert them to JSON remediations using the common library. And right now it works because the CVE ID, this is what we use to reference vulnerabilities from remediations, are predictable. So you can, you don't have to, the code works even though remediation works on vulnerabilities that are not the ones in the reports with possibly unique IDs, but the one in the internal data model Gymnasium uses. But it's fine because it's all, we can generate the CVE ID as long as we got all the fields. And so this is why. Anyways, you can have a look at my notes with the comments I shared with you. It's all in there. It's pretty similar in the case of Clar. We could update the code in such a way that it works even if the IDs are random. That's possible, but we have to update the code. And I don't know if you're following this because my connection is not stable.
Yeah, I'm definitely following it. I think the only thing I see is this use case where maybe it's ran at a different time and they were random. Being able to resolve that lookup, like you said, we'd have to write code for that. If we did it from code and it ran in multiple pipelines, then it would no longer be unique across the analyzer. So they're kind of in conflict at that level. Does that make sense, Olivier? Where you're wanting this thing across, but then the actual analyzers, when they need to auto remediate, almost need to take a specific occurrence output and generate ID so they can say this is fixed. Right?
Yeah, and this is why we shouldn't change that. And instead, as Fabian was pointing out, we need to generate the ID when first pathing the report and find out the findings, are they on the touch ID? And then when we do the remediation, we need to have a different lookup than generating the same ID and finding the match, because it's no longer possible. But instead, we will leverage probably the same logic, which is how do you recognize which vulnerability you're currently trying to fix? By looking at the primary identifier and the location. But this
okay.
is, I think, internal to us in the way we are doing remediation. And probably, depending on the way you're implementing the remediation, you will need different ways to look up at the finding.
So we have no plans to support third-party remediations.
They could. It's just that they are responsible to do it their own way.
Well,
And
they can put the code bit in that remediation chunk, right? Just like we do.
Yep. And they just need to make sure that the remediation they are putting in the report are provided with an ID that is matching which findings they will fix. And it's their own job to figure out how to do that. And the reason why using an ID, specific ID property, is that we don't want to enforce them to do this in any specific way. They do their own business and we do our own. We can provide them explanation about how we are doing it, but we don't want to enforce it.
Okay, so this very much so needs to point to a specific occurrence because it's saying this occurrence is solved. And then the lookup would be the same way that we would group vulnerabilities or whatnot, saying this is the same kind of vulnerability and we've solved that kind. So anything that matches this grouping of a thing, it solves those, and then it points at specifically this unique identifier across all runs saying we've solved this and this and this and this and this, all of these occurrences, right? Is that right?
Yeah, because currently we consider that the remediation is attached to the same pipeline as the user finding that has been reported. And this makes sense because the way you're fixing things is often tied to the specific location at this point in time. So attached to this is current state of the project, so the scope, or the line number, and things like that.
So I want to get an answer written down for this one. Do we need randomness?
I think so, because this makes sure that we are not making duplicates.
Well, it also reduces the risk that if a customer is using both us and a third party, that we'd both end up with the same ID if we add a random element.
We could also just pick index and join that with the report run. That would be guaranteed unique, right?
Yeah, if I may, in the, hopefully the connection is stable now. In the merge request right now, the ID is generated using all the fields of the vulnerability finding. The good thing is that if you find a remediation for one and you have a duplicate, then the remediation applies to both because that's the exact same vulnerability based on the fields we've got. So it's not an issue. But then if you want to debug, and debugging is another need we have, it's not as accurate because you may want to say, you may want to refer to this specific finding in this generated by this particular scanning job. And you can't talk about duplicates in a meaningful way when they have the same ID. So, but out of debugging, to me, having the same ID for the same fields, the same object, it's fine.
Maybe, so it sounds like what would be nice would be a semi-random identifier, namely one that seems random, like a timestamp, but is stable. So it prevents collisions. It's not something to depend on, but at least that way, for debugging, etc., we can either, I don't know, use some kind of mock or something to ensure that it's easier. Does that make sense? This is a bit one-sided because Olivia left, so we can make all the decisions now.
It does, and maybe we can have we can randomize that with an ID that would be specific to the scan, and that would be very convenient for the tests, actually. Because if it's all random, there's not much you can test. I mean, it makes for complicated tests. It's doable,
yeah.
It's not great.
Well, that's what we were talking about yesterday. Is like I'm wondering how annoying this is going to make our test projects and updates to those. I guess if the data were never to change, then caching the entire thing would be fine. if it's random, then we're going to have to update our tests with every run unless we change our comparison logic again.
Unless we ignore the film, but then, and we would have an extra test just to prove that it's unique. And then we would have, so we would have a test to prove uniqueness, and then we would have a test to, the test proving that there's that the link between remediations and vulnerabilities are good would be more complicated because you don't know the exact value, so you get to compare, which is fine. But again, it's more complex and needed. And yes, and if you randomize or if you inject the idea of the scan, like we combine, then we have UIDs in the context of the pipeline, which is just easier to deal with. Because initially we had this idea of combining the unique ID of the scanner with the unique ID, with the ID of the vulnerability. That would be unique in that context. But it's just easier if the ID is unique in the context of the pipeline. Again, keep in mind that I'd like to be able, especially for dependent scanning, because it's expensive, to have the remediation job out of the dependent scanning itself, out of the scanning job, so that people can skip it, users can skip it, tweak it, set a different timeout, whatnot. And if you have,
yeah, that makes sense.
IDs, it's fine.
The thing to expose there is, here's the not ID, but the thing that you can use to group what all this solves, and then Rails or wherever else can look up all the occurrences that it solves specifically, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So if auto remediation happens at a different point, we no longer know what the random IDs were created for those things, right? And so
what different point in the same pipeline? Just be clear on that.
Oh, okay. So maybe it could pass it forward or something. So,
yeah. So yeah, the idea in that case is that the remediation job would would process the output of the scanning job, which is not possible right now because reports are not exposed as normal artifacts. But let's say in the future that it's exposed as an artifact. Actually, it's possible to add a few lines of code to the YAML CI configuration file to do that. And the remediation job would process this artifact, try to fix vulnerabilities, and then create a remediation object using the ID of what it has been found and what has been fixed. Sorry. So that works. No backend involved to do that, which is good.
So to a scenario here, I'm curious if this would be an okay constraint. So Lucas, myself, and you all open an MR at a repo, and we're all building off of the same master, so we all have the same vulnerability, or it would all find the same occurrence, so to speak. All of our pipelines would find it, generate some random ID, unique across all runs. It could pass it on to the next job that would know to say it fixes it for that occurrence, but it wouldn't actually, it technically fixes, all the other ones too.
No, and
sorry,
yeah,
I gotta drop because there might be a problem with the demo, so I'm gonna jump over there, and that might end this recording. So if you're all good, then cool. But